I'd just like to introduce the symposium here quickly to you. Mental health is currently a major issue that's pummeling a demographic that is not largely represented in our church, and that's the youth and young adults ages 15 to 24. Now, according to an article by ABC News, the proportion of high school students with persistent feelings of hopelessness and suicide increased by, guess how much? 40% from 2009 to 2019. Over 10 years, it increased 40%. And that's according to a CDC survey. Now, in 2021, there was another survey that came from the CDC, and it found that nearly 60% of teen girls have said that they feel persistently, have feelings of persistent sadness and hopelessness, and 30% have seriously thought about committing suicide. So you see that we have a problem. More than 6,600 people between the age of 10 and 24 died by suicide in 2020. And these are based on estimates from the National Center of Health Statistics, and one third of U.S. teen girls seriously considered attempting suicide in 2021. So you can see that we are faced with tremendous challenges. There's a lot of people hurting, especially our younger people. And so I'm thankful for the speakers for this weekend. They're going to be addressing these issues and giving us positive information on how we might be helped or be able to help others. And just one more statistical point of interest concerning adults. PTSD affects 3.6% of the adult population. That's 9 million people. So you can see there's a need for a symposium like we're having this weekend. So I'd like to welcome all of you to the symposium, and I hope you brought your listening ears with you because there's going to be a lot of good information. Our speaker schedule will be this. Tomorrow from 2 to 3 p.m. we have Dr. Jennifer Schwartzer. She's going to be talking about abuse in the church. And then at 3:30 to 4:30 we have Shannon Vega, and she's going to be discussing child-teen development and mental health warning signs. Tonight, we have David Jones. He's going to be talking to us about trauma in the brain, and I'd just like to introduce David at this point in time. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist. He's a nationally certified counselor, and he's a Washington-approved clinical supervisor. He owns and operates a private practice in Chehalis, just up the street, and provides supervisory services for the Stephen A. Cohen Military Family Clinic in Lakewood, Washington. He's been in the mental health field for over 15 years, and has specialized training in trauma treatments such as EDMR, and that's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. He is passionate about helping people. I know that from personal experience, and he wants to help them heal from their traumas, and he loves helping couples and families repair and strengthen their bonds. David serves people from all walks of life and also offers Christian counseling to those seeking to integrate their faith into their mental health journey. So I want to introduce David tonight and bring him up. This evening, he's going to be discussing the brain and trauma, and he'll specifically cover the questions: what is trauma, how it works in the brain, and how we heal from trauma.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm glad everyone can join us this evening. We are going to be, as Pastor Justin had introduced, we'll be talking about healing the traumatized brain. So we have a lot of information that we're going to cover. Some of the information is a little bit technical, but I tried to make sure that we have a very comprehensible way to talk about this really important subject. So I will go ahead and get this set up for you all so you can see with me. Now, how many people are fairly familiar with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? How many people have a little bit of a knowledge? Okay, so for some of you, some of this information will in fact be a review. But for the rest of you, this may be some new information that you've not heard before. So let me see if I can reconnect here. Try this one more time. All right. There we go. Okay, all right, everybody can see that up there. So again, we'll be talking about healing the traumatized brain, and we'll be talking about the neuroscience of trauma. So trauma is a really complicated diagnosis. It's actually a diagnosis that has many branches. But before we go too far into that, I wanted to try to explain 3 points. One is finding out what trauma is, like, so what is trauma? 2 is finding out how it works. And 3 is figuring out how we heal from it. So those of you who received handouts, you have handouts there. One of those handouts, the one that has the colorful graph on it, that one will show you what happens in the body as you go through the full wave of a stress response. The second handout that you have there is going to look specifically at how we heal the trauma. So it won't have the notes for all the other parts, but it will have the basic pointers on how we can heal from trauma. So as we're looking at this question of what is trauma, I thought of a scenario that I think everyone can relate to. So just imagine that you are driving along down the road. You're just trying to head over to work, and you have your phone next to you, and you're talking to a family member or a friend, just carrying on conversation. Maybe you're both listening to the radio and singing along. And then you get that little ding notification that tells you someone has sent you a text message. And because you all are not like me, you don't actually look down at your phone. But in my scenario, I do, and I just want to check and see who sent something to me. And out of the periphery, I see flashing red lights. And that immediately tells me that something is about to happen. So immediately, I start slamming on my brakes, and I come screeching to a halt. During that time, as I'm sliding toward this car, hoping that I'm not going to crash into it, several things begin to happen in my body. One of the things that happens in my body is that my heart rate begins to skyrocket. The second thing that happens in my body is that my palms may begin to sweat. Now, some of you may not be aware of this, but your palms don't sweat because you're hot. Your palms sweat because you feel stress. And that's why sometimes if people have heart conditions and other types of things, their palms can get very sweaty, but it's because it's a stress response in the body. The next thing that will happen is I may gasp. And I don't know if anybody has ever had a situation that caught you by surprise, and involuntarily you gasp. I told my kids about this, and they thought it was really funny because I used to take these walks where I'd be just kind of walking along and reading and maybe praying or doing whatever it is that I do in the morning. And in my head, I'm like, well, I'm fine. It's dark outside, but I don't care because I'm this tough individual, at least in my head. And so as I'm walking around, I was reading, and then out of the periphery again, I saw someone coming. Now, in my head, I thought, oh, David, don't worry about it. But my body doesn't care what my head thinks, because what actually happened is as I was walking along, I went like this, like really loud, and then I wanted to play it off because I didn't want anybody thinking that I was afraid, and so I tried to do something. I said, and I thought about that, and I was like, no one thinks that I was breathing that deeply so I can cough, but it's involuntary. Because before I could say anything about it, I see my body doing all this stuff, and I'm already thinking, David, what are you doing? But there's no time for that. The response is immediate. The other thing that happens is you may notice that you can barely hear the radio anymore. And part of the reason for that is that your ears, the muscles in your ears begin to dial down so that you only hear low frequencies. So even if the person was still talking to you, suddenly the conversation stops making sense. And that's because the parts of your brain responsible for helping you to process sounds start to, and especially voices, tone down. The reason to listen to low tones is because low tones are usually the frequencies that predators use when they growl. So everything that's happening in your body is doing this so that you're prepared to fight. One other really cool thing is that when you are feeling that kind of stress, your body also sends out a lot of things into your blood, like your white blood cells increase. And while you're doing that, it's preparing your body to start having blood clots. Now, that might sound kind of interesting, but if you are in a fight, let's say I'm fighting with a lion or something, if they scratch me, I need to be able to clot my blood quickly. And so it actually prepares your body to start having blood clots there. So all of this stuff happens rapidly. Now, if you're lucky and you don't have a traumatic incident, then all of those things begin to come back down. You begin to feel calm again, and everything is back to normal. So what is trauma? So trauma, the best way I've learned to be able to explain it to people is when you go up that hill, all those things happen in the body, but you don't come all the way back down. And the way that you can tell is that when people experience trauma, they actually have harder times tracking with conversation. When they experience something that's stressful, it doesn't take them, if we're just looking at like that graph that you have there, if you look at it, there's the red zone on top. The person in this one kind of stays on the high end or the mid-range of that yellow zone on the graph. So this is kind of like they just barely drop down. If we were talking about on a 1 to 10 scale, they maybe stay at about a 6. And so it makes it to where everyday stressors, that might be a 3, for them it's a 9, right? So you just add 6 to everything that they experience. And so it actually creates these huge stress responses. And so one way to understand trauma is that the body cannot calm down. Now, this is a really good quote, and I find that it's a very useful one when we think about trauma. Trauma is not what happens to us, but what happens in us. Now, the difference between those two is extremely important because you can have an entire group of people all experience the same car accident, or like with the 9/11 attacks, people that were present there, you know that only less than 15% of the people that were in that experienced PTSD, which means that trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside of you. All right. Does that make sense to everyone so far? So trauma is not what happens to us, but what happens inside of us. So what exactly is going on inside? I wanted to just share with you the definition of the word trauma. The word trauma is actually the Greek word that means wound. So when we talk about traumas, what we're talking about are wounds. Now, the way you heal a wound is not by erasing the past, right? Because there's no way to undo the past. Everybody follow that? So then if we're going to heal a trauma, what needs to heal is the wound. And a lot of times when people come in, they say they just want to forget the past, but forgetting the past is not what's critical. What's critical is healing the wound. So we're going to look really quickly at the stress response. So that little graph that you have, you can follow along with there, and this will walk us through what happens in the body when you experience a stressor. Now, I gave you just a really brief version of it, but we're going to look at what it looks like from the calm section all the way up. And as we talk about each of these symptoms, I'm going to try to weave in solutions along the way. So there are 3 levels in which you can experience each one of these stages. That's behaviors, thoughts/feelings, and in the body. So when somebody is in the calm state, this is what's referred to as ventral vagal activation. You don't have to remember all these fancy terms, but this is what's happening when you are calm. Your vagus nerve is a nerve that, it's your 10th cranial nerve, and it goes from your face and vocal cords all the way down to your gut. It is the longest cranial nerve in the body, and it's called a vagus nerve after the word vega, which is to wander, like a vagabond. And so it's this wandering nerve that literally comes into contact with all your internal organs, and it connects your brain to what's happening in your body. It is like the emotional nerve of the body. And so when you're in a calm state, your thoughts and feelings, your behaviors are more towards socialization. So we take for granted that when we talk, I can fluctuate my voice. So when I'm trying to sound pleasant, I talk a little bit higher, and everybody understands that means pleasant. But if I start talking like this, then everybody's like, okay, what's he upset about? And just immediately, just by changing the tone of your voice, you can begin to shift your moods. So when you're in a calm mood, that vocal inflection actually helps you to stay in that calm state. At this level, thoughts are usually on the idea of like, I'm connected, I'm grounded, I'm really paying attention, I feel curious about what's going on in the environment. This is the calm state. This is the ventral vagal state. So this is when we feel safe. During this time, your parasympathetic nervous system is active, digestion is working well, you have good immunity, there's good circulation going on in the body, and many other processes. In fact, anybody here familiar with that neurotransmitter or that hormone oxytocin? Everybody kind of heard of this before? When you are in a ventral vagal state, oxytocin is actually something that is being released in your body. Now, like I said, throughout this, I want to make sure I'm sharing with you all ways to make sure that you can start using skills right away. We experience oxytocin when we are allowed to be close to or hug someone. And so the actual act of bringing someone close to your body, someone that you trust, actually can begin to put you into this calm state where you feel grounded and connected with others. That is the calm state. The next level up is the stress one. So this was the car accident scenario I was just running through with you all. There's the increased arousal, increased attention. But this level of stress is not necessarily the bad kind of stress. This is something that maybe you feel stressed, like you're about to take a test the next day, or you have to do a public speaking engagement and more people showed up than you thought they would. And so that is the stress response. And it can be extremely useful in helping you to be focused in your attention and careful with your words. You can be confident in your ability to take control effectively. So we're still good. Now, this is where things start to get more difficult, is when you have like a hypersympathetic nervous system response. You have 2 branches of your autonomic nervous system. You have your sympathetic. Sympathy is not in reference to emotion. The sympathy is a reference to the fact that you are ready to fight. And so this is your fight-flight behaviors. thoughts on this level is still I can, but I'm going to have to work for it. So when I was talking about my silly walking journey, this person riding up behind me, hopefully, if I breathe in that big breath of air, part of the reason I'm doing that is my body is preparing to fight and still believes I can win. And so I get myself into that stage. But it's definitely a fight. But you're still in the I can zone. At those points, you can have emotions that range anywhere from frustration to rage if you're in the fight side, or from concern to panic if you're in the flight side. So I either feel like I can totally outrun whatever's chasing me, or I feel like I can take on and fight whatever is coming after me. During this time, though, when you're in this kind of activation, there's a decrease in digestion, there's an increase in circulation away, or a decrease of circulation towards your vital organs, so it actually moves away from your stomach and like all of these, what's referred to as your viscera, and goes out to your extremities. Now, this is part of the reason why when people experience chronic stress, they have digestion problems. So anybody who's ever had like chronic anxiety, you notice sometimes you're not as hungry and you don't feel as good. Part of the reason for that is the blood is going towards your extremities so that you can run. It's not preparing you to live, it's preparing you to survive, right? So when you are in survival mode, you're not in living mode, right? And those are very different ways to exist. And if you stay in survival mode for long periods of time, you start to not really enjoy the business of living. And so this is what is happening in the body. This is like that sympathetic state, but it's extremely helpful when you are in the middle of a fight. It also increases fuel availability. There's more oxygen in the blood and lots of other pieces here. Your bronchi begin to dilate. But if there's not a real fight going on, if you're experiencing an activation like that, but the only thing that's happened is you're playing a video game or you're listening to politicians argue about things, that is not a good time to be in that fight state. And so we actually want to do a better job of managing our stresses and kind of minimizing those things that put us in that state, because it physically puts us in a place where our body's not in a place to heal. The other thing that goes down during this time is your immune system actually shuts down more. This is part of the reason why when somebody experiences chronic stress, they also get sick way more often, because fighting off the cold is not a priority. If I am being chased by a bear, but then let's say like an hour ago someone sneezed on me, you can guess which one of those things is more important, to fight the cold or to fight the bear. What do you think? The bear is going to be a priority. But if you're constantly chased by bears, then eventually the cold and everything else, including things like cancer, will catch you. And so it's super important to understand that trauma is what's happening in the body. And there are a lot of people that are seeing the doctors currently right now for things like sciatica, gout, rheumatoid arthritis that would never exist if they just managed their stress, if they were able to cope with the underlying factors that are causing the disease. So this is the one where it gets really difficult. So in this one, this is what's referred to as a dorsal vagal response. This is the lowest part of the vagus nerve. This is the part that comes in contact with your gut. This is your parasympathetic nervous system, usually the part that helps you to rest and digest. But when it's turned up all the way to the max, it actually causes you to like freeze or collapse. So everybody's heard about fight, flight, but you have a few other things that you do too. There's also freeze and faint, right? So we live here, a lot of y'all live here in Washington. Most of y'all are here from Washington, yes? Yeah, okay. So when you're driving down the road and you see a deer in the middle of the road, what does that deer do that you wish it didn't? Yes, it just sits there, and it's like, how many times do you have to see headlights coming towards you before you realize this is the time to flee? But it doesn't, it just freezes. But there is a reason for that. And when the animal is freezing, it's not calm. Like freezing is not calm. If I asked you to try to sit perfectly still and don't move, guess what you have to do with all of your muscles? They're all tight, right? And so right before, and once you go into that sympathetic, going into this dorsal vagal one, there's the freeze response, but above that is the faint. And now I'm just going to share with you a few things that happen with the faint. So in there, the thoughts and feelings, it should not say I'm connected, but it should say on there that the person feels helpless. This is where the person begins to dissociate. Some of you maybe remember the old diagnosis, multiple personality disorder. Everybody kind of remember that, and Sybil and that whole story. Well, dissociation happens at this level. This is when somebody has reached a state of stress where they believe there's nothing left that they can do. Like, I can't fight, I can't run, it's over. This is like the I can't stage in that activation. When this happens, The person on the emotional level can feel trapped or feel shame or feel helpless and begin to dissociate. In either case, it completely freezes the person up. During this time, there are increases in things like endorphins, which would sound like a good thing, but what happens is the endorphins get released into the body and they cause the person to go numb. Many people that I know that have experienced trauma, they talk about how they just can't feel anything. And some of you may know somebody who has been cutting and doing things like this. It's usually because this part of the parasympathetic nervous system is overactive and it's creating a situation where they feel numb. Now, there's a survival reason for this, because once you get to this place, there's no point anymore in experiencing pain, because at this point, you're either going to try to play dead and escape, or you just have to deal with the fact that it's all over. And so you have a lot of people who are living as though their life is over already, because they're caught in a survival state that prepares you to die. So during this time, this decreases your heart rate, your blood pressure, your temperature, your muscle tone. This is part of the reason why people can just collapse. One of the symptoms, by the way, of depression is feeling sluggish. This is not accidental. This is your dorsal vagal nerve going hyperactive during these times. So, lots of things happening in the body. I'm going to share with you what are some of the main signs of PTSD. As Pastor Justin had noted there in the beginning, it affects 3.6% of the population. It is something that affects 9 million people in the United States, but there are 4 main ways in which PTSD shows up. One of them is re-experiencing. There is a gigantic difference between remembering something and re-experiencing something. When I remember something, it's like, oh yeah, I remember, when we went to Six Flags and like we were on the roller coasters and it was a really good time. Versus when I worked with soldiers, they would talk about like, I remember hearing the sounds of like the Abrams and like hearing these helicopters, and when they would fly over and you can see them when they start talking, their vision is out here. It's like the 1,000-yard stare, because they're not remembering anything. They are reliving. They're re-experiencing it. And that is one of the hallmark differences between what trauma does and what bad memories do. A trauma is not something that's just remembered, it's relived. And part of the reason that happens too, that makes it so difficult, is it comes in pieces. And so people who've experienced assaults and traumas like that, smells will get somebody triggered. Sights and sounds will get someone triggered. If somebody, for instance, when they were growing up, had the parent yell at them, someone just saying, hey, you dropped your keys, like just someone saying that immediately sets off the alarm bells, and the person is not remembering what it was like when they were yelled at. They're re-experiencing it. And so re-experiencing is one part. The second part is avoidance. People want to keep as much distance as they can away from feeling this way, because it's a pretty awful way to feel. So people who experience traumas oftentimes will isolate themselves or keep themselves into predictable spaces. You can usually tell who the firefighters and first responders and sometimes people who were military, you can tell where they like to sit in the restaurant. Anybody know where that is? The back corner. That's right. Yeah, the back corner where you can see everybody. Right? All of these things are designed to make sure that they don't get startled, that no one tries to sneak up on them. It is a process of coping. The other one is cognitive and mood. Oftentimes the mood becomes depressed. Thoughts become very absolute. The world's a terrible place. No one can be trusted, things like that. And then, of course, the arousal part, which is what I was walking through before, where the person is experiencing hyperarousal, constantly fidgety, restless on edge, or easily annoyed or quick to anger because they don't come back down to 1, they stay up at 6. So that is trauma. These are the main signs of PTSD that we can see. There's some other signs that I wanted to point out too, ones that are little paid attention to, and one of them is body dysmorphic disorder. People who have trauma, the co-occurrence between these two is extremely high. Of the people who have things like body dysmorphic disorder, and this is when somebody begins to look at their bodies and think that they're ugly or that they're fat or that when it clearly doesn't match with what the rest of the world can see, amongst people who have that disorder, something like 70% of them also have PTSD, which means that one is clearly a factor towards the other. Because when people experience a trauma, it changes the way they see the world and the way they see themselves. Everything in perception begins to shift. So body dysmorphic disorder can sometimes be a signal to someone that there may be trauma involved. The other one is rigid rituals. Everything has to be done a very specific way. They have to leave at a very specific time. Everyone has to talk at a specific volume. Everything is extremely rigid. And the reason for that, again, is because if I have to stay at a 6, I have to find some way to keep myself from going to a 10. I can't do it inside, so I try to do it outside. If I turn my world into a box, then I'm not going to be surprised or hurt or terrified. Increased physical pain. So you can have this work both ways. For some people, they can experience increased physical pain. I was working with a gentleman who had a brain injury, had a TBI, and he had PTSD. And we were sitting in my office, and we were having a conversation, and something really triggered him. And at some point while we were sitting there, he just started going, and he started putting his head down, and then it seemed like he was having a seizure. I'm like, hey, and we'll just call him Alan for today. Alan, are you okay? He was totally non-responsive, and I'm like, okay, I don't know if he's having a seizure. He starts to go down toward the ground. And so I had called one of his workers who had way more experience than I did. This was on my second meeting, and I was still an intern, so that was fun. And so I had this, he told me hey man, pour water on his head, which I was like, what? Are you serious? He's like, yeah, just pour some water on his head. And so, I'm over here pouring water on this guy's head in my office. This is the weirdest day of therapy I've ever participated in. We called the ambulance. The ambulance comes over there, and they try to help the guy. And one of the ambulance, comes over and puts his hand on his shoulder. It's like, hey, Mr. Allen, we're here to help you. And he just punches the guy and swears at him just out of nowhere, even though it seemed like he was having a seizure. He just explodes. And then after the ambulance was understandably frustrated, he walked out of there. He's like, I'm not going to fight this guy. And when we sat down, I remember the first words he said to me, he's like, that guy tried to hurt me. I was like, that's fascinating, because it was a very gentle touch on the shoulder. But when people have experienced traumas, one of the things that happens is because sometimes they can have a lot of blood flow to the surface of their skin and will actually make them more sensitive. So when you've had the flu, you notice that sometimes the sheets hurt. And part of the reason for that is all of this inflammation in the body. And chronic stress will do something very similar. So people can have increased sensitivity to pain. Poor healing. The immune system is kicked all the way down. And so whenever they get cuts, even things as simple as that, they actually heal more slowly. So again, trauma actually has long-reaching effects. Now, don't worry, we're not going to talk about all the bad stuff. We will get to the good things too, but I really want you to understand that this is a serious diagnosis that is not just a mental health disorder. It is a body disorder. Okay. Premature aging symptoms, as I mentioned before, I've worked with people who, as early as in their 40s, have rheumatoid arthritis and gout in their 40s. And that's not right. That's not how that's supposed to go. But it's the body has shifted from living to surviving, and it has consequences. The last one I wanted to point out to you is that one with the asterisks at it, and that's socially withdrawing. Now, one of the things that they have found consistently is that when you socially withdraw, it actually exaggerates your fear response. We're actually way more afraid when we're alone than when we're with other people. I know it sounds like a duh thing, but it's really important, because oftentimes when people have traumas, they don't want to be around people, and that's understandable because people don't understand what's going on with them. They can't predict the actions of other people, but then it has an adverse effect, because once they isolate themselves, it makes everything much scarier. All right. So some of you may be familiar with the adverse childhood experiences. Anybody familiar with ACE's study? All right, so the ACE study was something that was done in Kaiser Permanente. They were just trying to track the health records of people who were dealing with a range of health conditions, including obesity. But as they did these studies, they kept finding the same information over and over again. And this is what made up the ACE study. One of the categories was abuse, that they experienced some kind of physical abuse, as you can see depicted there, whether it was physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse, or they experienced neglect, which could have been physical or emotional neglect. Now, sometimes people think about abuse and they think, okay, if a child was hit, that's really bad, but if they were neglected, not so bad. But it actually turns out that that's not quite correct. When children are neglected, sometimes the consequences of neglect can be more severe than the consequences of actual physical abuse. And that is because the brain is a social organ. Your brain from the beginning is designed to connect with other people. And when that connection is lost, the brain does not develop properly. Children who have been neglected oftentimes end up with IQ points that are anywhere from 15 to 30 points lower than the average. It's not healthy for the person to be alone. So neglect is actually a really profound thing. And then the third category are household dysfunction. It's the environmental piece. So if you want to think about trauma happening in 3 different ways, you have these 3 different categories. One is developmental trauma, what can happen while one is growing up. Then there's the shock trauma. This is like if somebody experiences a physical or sexual assault, or if somebody experiences like a direct emergency, it's like that shocking trauma. And then there is chronic environmental trauma, where if somebody is constantly exposed to a lack of resources, is constantly on the verge of not knowing where their food is coming from, these things can also cause it. Of the three, the worst of them by far, from all my experience, has been the developmental trauma, because the developmental trauma sets the stage for everything else that follows. In that ACE study in particular, they found that people who had ACE scores that were particularly high were more likely to die before the age of 65, were more likely to have cancer, more likely to have COPD, were more likely to have almost every disease you can think of, STDs included, but also more likely for addiction. It actually shortened their lifespans, because the earlier the trauma starts, the earlier the person lives in a survival state rather than living, right? And it has a real physiological effect upon them. All right, so one of the ways that trauma can also happen is something that's called learned helplessness. Has anybody heard this term before, learned helplessness? Okay, so learned helplessness, this is actually an experiment that was done by Martin Seligman and Stephen F. Meyer. Now, what they did is they conducted an experiment on dogs, which to me seemed like really not very nice. But anyway, they wanted to try to see what would happen if dogs were conditioned to feel helpless. And so here's how they set up the experiment. Dogs from the first group were caged and were made to wait for a period of time before being released, and each one of them were going to go through different conditions. So condition one is you have dogs who are going to be put in a cage, and then the door is going to open at a certain time. This is what's referred to as your control group, just regular dogs sitting in a kennel. They just sit there while the door is closed, and then the door opens. No big deal. Then you have, and so this is the timed one. They just get out when the clock says get out. Nothing happens. The second one, though, is the conditioned learning group. And in this conditioned learning group, the dogs were put in the kennel, and then they electrified the ground inside of the kennel, which is really messed up. And these are like puppies, too, so it was really messed up. And so when they electrified it, the dogs actually had a button inside the cage, and if they hit the button, it would open the door so that they could escape. So that was condition number 2. Then you had condition number 3, where the dogs were shocked, like the ground was electrically shocking their paws, and whether they pushed the button or waited for the clock, nothing let them out of there. They were just shocked without any method of escape. Now, while this experiment is horrible, it taught us something. So when they took the dogs out of those conditions, what they did next was they put them in this new box. Now, in this new box, you can see that in all 3 of these conditions, you have all 3 of these types of dogs are going to go into this box. And in the middle of it, there's a little wall. Only one side is electrified. So they're going to sit on that part right there. They're going to electrify it. And all the dog has to do is jump over a little wall, which all of them are very capable of doing. And then they'll be fine. So you could probably predict what happened. For the dogs that just had the timer, they jumped the wall. For the dogs who learned they can push the button to get out, they also jumped the wall. But for the dogs that were electrocuted without any hope of escape, they just sat there and took it, even when escape was right in front of them. And this is the nature of trauma, because what happens is the brain gets rewired to believe that it's helpless. And what I've often seen when I've worked with people with trauma, what happens is it's not that they will never fight, but they'll find themselves fighting at the wrong times. And so they get in a fight with the person at the store, but then when somebody is actually trying to hurt them, it goes unnoticed. Or when I've worked with people in domestic violence relationships, like they'll reject all these people, like if it's a lady and she's dating men, and she'll reject all these men who just seem like nice guys because they're not tough enough and all this other stuff, and then they let the other guy who is completely abusive, let him come right through the front door. Because everything has been wired differently. Once they're in that situation, it's like they feel helpless. They feel perfectly capable of protecting themselves from safe people, but incapable of protecting themselves from people who are dangerous. And so all these things actually happen in the brain too. So this isn't just things that it's not just all in your head. You actually have 2 main systems that go on in the brain. You have what's referred to as the dopamine pathways, and then you have what's referred to as serotonin pathways. All right, so everybody knows about serotonin a little bit. Like you have SSRIs and antidepressants that people will sometimes use. SSRIs are also good for anxiety. Now, serotonin is usually a very helpful neuromodulator in the brain, but serotonin can actually become an enemy when it's used at the wrong times. So in the blue, You have the dopamine system, which is the system that helps you to get going, get moving. And then you have the serotonin system, which oftentimes helps you to relax and just be okay. Don't worry, or just don't be active. You can just chill out. So when these two things are active, when somebody, like when these dogs were getting shocked, there are two parts of the brain that were getting very active. One of them is this little part down there that says like the Rafe nucleus. And then another part that was getting activated there is the periaqueductal gray, which I don't know if it put it in this picture here, but both of those are parts of the brain that get activated whenever we experience a stressor. Now, when the helplessness happens, like when those dogs kept getting shocked, their periaqueductal gray, the one that has a dopamine system, wanted them to jump out, right? But because it wasn't working, the thing that turns on instead is that Rafe nuclei. It's actually the dorsal Rafe nuclei, so that system, when that turns on, it releases a bunch of serotonin, and what that does to the brain is it tells the brain, you can't do anything, you're stuck. And so this is literally what's happening in the brains of people, is there's a part of their brain that's shutting down their survival response, and it won't let them escape. And so these things are real. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, if I was that person that just took it, or I just decided just to lay there, did I do something wrong? I'm gonna show you something really quick. This particular video right here will show you what the purpose of that play dead response is. And so we'll cue this up. It's a very short video, but just notice what happens here. There's no sound. So there's a hyena. Hyena wants to steal the food from the cheetah. And as you see there, there's this gazelle that just seems to be dead. And so hyena's trying to eat the gazelle, which is not very nice. And if you can see, the gazelle's its leg is behind its ear. He chases off the cheetah, and the gazelle says, I'm out of here, and he bolts. Every time I see that video, I'm like, yes, that was awesome. That's what the response is designed to do. That's what the response is designed to do. And it's actually kind of merciful, because if the gazelle were going to die, it would feel almost no pain. It actually turns up all the painkillers inside the body. It slows the heart rate down, and then it's almost just, it's like it's time to go to sleep. But as soon as that gazelle saw that there was a way of escape, that thing bounced up and was like, I'm done. Y'all can fight all you want. I'm going home. And look, the fact that every single one of you are sitting here means you made it. And that immediately tells me that I think it's time for us to get up and run. Like, we don't have to stay there anymore. We don't have to stay there anymore. Now, it'd be nice if my just saying that made everything better, but I'm saying that because I believe there is a way of escape. All right, so I'm going to skip the explanatory style. I just put this up here just so you all can see. This is all the complicated stuff. This is just a paragraph out of a study that talks about the learned helplessness. Some of you know what this thing means, that TLDR. Anybody know what that stands for? Nobody does. Okay, wrong generation. All right, so it's too long, didn't read. So y'all don't have to read all that stuff. But that's just a snippet of what is going on in your brain when these things happen. So your brain on trauma. So I want to give you all a free brain model. And so y'all did not know this, but at great expense to ourselves, we've made sure that you can have a brain model. So if you actually reach under the pew that you're sitting in, you can just reach under there, and there'll be a model that's right under there for you to grab. And so you all go ahead and grab that. And then after you've grabbed it, you go ahead and pull out your hand. You pull out your hand, and you have one of the coolest brain models that you can possibly use, and it's right here in the palm of your hand. So I have to give credit both for the bad joke and the hand model to Dan Siegel. So my apologies for anybody with that. So Dan Siegel, he actually came up with this particular model. It's called the brain in the palm of your hand. And it's actually a way for you to understand your brain just by using your hand. So if you're looking at the palm of your hand, this part of your hand right here, the bottom of your hand, this is like your brain stem. This controls your heart rate. It regulates the basic symptoms of your body. Now, if you curl your thumb over, this thumb right here would be your limbic system. You can think about this as being like your emotional brain. You would have your amygdala over here, your hippocampus over here, but we can just think about it as your emotional brain. This top part up here, this is like your prefrontal cortex. So if you wrap your fingers around your thumb, what you're going to see is that there are your index and your middle finger and ring finger will wrap around your thumb. There are two parts of your brain that go right there. And if you notice, these two fingers touch both levels. It touches the emotional part of the brain and the brainstem. So when you curl it under there, these are the two parts of the brain that are responsible for helping the top part of your brain speak to the rest of your body and emotions. So that's kind of cool. So when you get really stressed out, like when I was about to hit the car, you're in this kind of mode. That's why I gasp, even though I don't want to, and I feel really stupid afterwards, but it doesn't matter because my prefrontal cortex doesn't get to tell me what to do. My thinking brain turns off. It's just my feeling brain. So this is like when people kind of like flip their lids or get upset. That's where we're going. But if somebody goes into a heightened activation where now the emotional brain goes off, because when this is here, you can still say a few things, but not a lot of really intelligent words. This is kind of the guttural kind of things and noises and gestures that we make towards people, sign language. I think that's what we call that. Anyway, don't do that. So when that goes offline, then we're in this state. And this is where people are like blacking out. They don't remember anything that they've done. Everything has kind of just went offline. And it's a very good way to think about what's happening in the brain. When people have PTSD, they're probably somewhere in like here, where they can still kind of talk, hold some order of conversation, but the connection is not quite there. And that's why they feel so dysregulated and dissociated from their bodies. So hopefully that's a neat model that you can use. There are two pathways to how you experience something. So when I talked about seeing the red lights out of the corner of your eye, this is your peripheral vision. At all times, your amygdala, that you can think about like as your smoke detector, is constantly scanning the environment for threats. So in that picture that you see there on your left, what does that look like to everyone? A snake. Now, before you can say it's a stick, by this point you're already jumping. Especially if you have a fear of snakes, you're already jumping high off the ground. And what's happened is that the image has gone through what's referred to as the low road. The low road is it goes to your thalamus. Your thalamus is kind of like the cook. It's the part that takes all the ingredients of your senses, like touch, smell, taste, sight, sound, all that, and brings them together in one little package. And then it goes from there to your amygdala, sets off the smoke detector, and then you have a fear response. When you have a chance to think, just like I did, and I realize it's a guy on a bike and not a car that's going to hit me, that goes on the high road, where it actually talks to the front part of the brain and allows me to respond accordingly. This is what we call being triggered. And so y'all probably heard that term being triggered a lot. Triggers are real, but that does not mean they are true. And that is something that I've been repeating a lot to many of my clients that I work with, that triggers are real, but that does not necessarily mean they are true. Now, some of you remember this little scene where, Jenny comes back to her house where all this terrible abuse has happened, and she starts throwing the rocks at the house. You all remember that? At this point, she is obviously triggered, like she's just having a normal conversation with them, and just, boom, is flooded with emotion. She starts throwing the rocks at the house. And you all remember that famous line that Forrest Gump said. What did he say? Sometimes, I guess, there just aren't enough rocks. Which was, as sweet as it was, brilliant, because the rocks can't take the past away. Because it's not about the house out there, it's about the house up here. And that is where the healing needs to take place. So, last couple of bits about the brain before we talk about the healing part here. So we talked about the amygdala, that's that fight-flight part. You can think about that like your smoke detector. The thalamus, that's like the cook. When people experience a trauma, that cook who brings together all the ingredients, when you experience a trauma, what happens is the thalamus can't pull it together very well. And so what happens is all the ingredients are spread all over the place. So you can think about if you were trying to bake a cake, if you take the flour and you throw it over here, and then you crack the eggs over there and you spill all this stuff all over the place, that's what's going on with the senses when somebody experiences a trauma. It's all over the place and it's a mess. This is why smells and sights and sounds can trigger somebody, but they can't really do a lot about it because it's not organized. Now, what's awesome about this is that it can get organized again, right? This is not where the story stops. The DLPFC, that part up there that looks like a little chalkboard diagram, this is the part of your brain that plans. I've kind of just named this as a good way to think about this one is kind of like you can think about this as being like the dad or the coach of the brain. This is the one that maps out plans for how you're supposed to deal with fear when things go down. When people experience trauma, that part gets rewired so that it's not sending any message anymore. Now there's no more plans, it's just got to jump into action. The MPFC, I think about that being like the mom. So you have an M over there now. The MPFC is kind of like the watchtower. It's that part that we talked about here that connects to the emotions. This is the part of your brain that talks to you and tells you everything's going to be all right. And you can actually train these parts of the brain to come back online. And that's the part that's so exciting to me. Now, to jump back over to what's going on, I like to think about the fact that the brain is rewired. When I hear people say when they've experienced trauma that they don't like people, I think about it the same way that I think about someone who says they don't like sitting in chairs. Now, why would you not want to sit in this chair here? What is going on with this chair? This is like the biggest IKEA fail that you can possibly imagine, right? The legs are facing the wrong way, right? And this is what's happening in the mind, though. When this happens in the mind, people get uncomfortable with things that normally should be comfortable. But this is a solvable problem because all the needed parts are there, right? The story is not over. It just needs to be rewired. So what helps us to get there? This was a little poem that I saw that I thought was kind of cute. It says, I don't go to therapy to find out if I'm a freak. I go when I find one and only answer every week. And when I talk about therapy, I know what people think, that it only makes you selfish and in love with your shrink. But oh, how I loved everybody else when I finally got to talk so much about myself. Now, that last line can sound like that's endorsing selfishness, but it's not, because when you go to a therapist and you talk about yourself, what makes it work is not the talking about yourself. What makes it work is that someone's actually listening. And just from being heard, things change inside of us. This is our first step when we talk about how to heal the brain. I obviously believe in therapy. It's why I do it. But there's some really cool things that you may not be aware of, is that when people are talking, they did an experiment where they had unexperienced therapists and really highly experienced therapists sit down and have conversations with people. For the really experienced therapists, they found that when they had them hooked up to electrodes and all these things, that their brains were actually synchronizing with each other. You have what's referred to as your right parietal temporal junction, and that part of your brain is responsible for understanding other people's minds and what's going on with them. And what's neat is you can actually look at that RTPJ and the other person and the therapist, and they're firing at exactly the same kind of rate. In fact, what's really cool is that's the exact same thing that happens when a mother is holding her child and making faces, and then the child goes, ooh, and then the mom goes, ooh. Like, that's what's happening. And if you looked at their brains, they're mirroring each other. Now, what's so powerful about that is that if you're sitting across from someone who loves you, then maybe you stop hating yourself, because you start to tune into someone who actually cares. And then maybe it gives you a little bit of permission to not look at yourself like you're useless or like you're trash or that you're no good to your family. Someone sees something good in you, and then suddenly you start to see something good in yourself as well. And it's not just that part of the brain, it's also that medial prefrontal cortex, that part we were talking about that hooks everything up and tells you everything is going to be okay. That part starts mirroring too. What they notice too is that when people, and these are all strategies that work, by the way, when the voices start to match, when people start kind of talking at about the same tone, they actually start to hook up to where even their heart rates start to get in sync. And if you're kind of up here and you're kind of freaking out, or your heart rate's way too low, and somebody talks to you about something exciting, if you're connected, then we actually get to heal because someone who is doing all right helps you to join them. It's incredible. The brain is a social organ. And so it makes sense to me that if anything we're going to heal it, we should expect it to have some sort of social element. And so we actually can borrow the feelings from other people. Another really cool thing that you can do, even if you're not good at it, because I'm not either, is sing with someone. Like, and even if you don't know how to carry a note, keep testing it until your voice is synchronized. Because when you're doing that, you're doing something else, by the way. When you sing, you're vibrating this part of your vagus nerve. And this is that ventral vagal one, that part that helps you to feel calm and connected. When you start vibrating this part of your vagus nerve, it stimulates it and actually helps you to start to relax a little bit more. Do you all want to sing with me? No? Okay, not there yet. All right. So idea to idea, when our ideas are lined up with each other, and this is one of the beauties of, like, some people are part of a faith and some people aren't, but when people share ideas like this, where they're actually in sync with each other, that also does it too. If we share like beliefs, that doesn't mean that you just believe anything just because other people believe it, but like if we really truly believe those things, we can sync up that way too. Now, of course, love is one of my favorite ways to get there. When people experienced love and they were shown pictures of people that they love, what happened was there are parts of the brain, for those of you who care about it, it's the insula, inferior cingulate, and cingulate nucleus. These are all parts that kind of do what's referred to as the mohawk of the brain. It's a really easy way to think about the brain. All the stuff down the midline in the middle is designed to integrate, and all the stuff on the outside is to take the stuff from the outside and help you understand that part. So the inside middle line, kind of an overgeneralization, the inside middle line is there to help you have self and bodily awareness and awareness of others. The outside is to have more awareness of the environment. So what they found is that when people were looking at pictures of people they loved, what would happen is that those parts of the brain that are kind of more towards the middle would get really active. Then it would decrease activity in some of these areas, like the amygdala, the smoke detector, and the frontal and temporal and parietal cortices on the sides. So they start to lose their tendency to scan for threats on the outside, and they just relax and feel love on the inside. It's really incredible. Love actually becomes something that helps people to feel safe, so they stop looking for threats. It's incredible. Love is a relief from scanning the outer world for threats and the inner world for shame. And so it's the same thing on the emotional side of it too. And that's why that little poem was talking about this. When people get to the place where they don't hate themselves, it actually helps their brain to stop being locked in a constant shame spiral where they're always thinking about how bad they are, how dumb they are. If they can actually just love, then they stop wasting that energy. And by the way, it is using energy. Don't make any mistake about it. When you use your energy that way, it's not going to the places where you might want to have your energy go. I like this quote here, that therapy is the safe emergency. Okay. So the other thing that I like to talk about here is how people can get rid of the old scripts. Sometimes we can live by the script where I focus all my energy on making sure the trauma never happens again. But if we're living that way, then we end up with the script of never again, rather than a script of how do I live and how do I move forward. It keeps you facing backwards. And so switching from a survival script that just says, how do I survive, to a life script of how do I want to live, that becomes a key transition. Okay. Resilience. Resilience is another skill that also helps people to develop and adapt. So we learned about the learned helplessness thing, and in the same way that helplessness can be learned, so can resilience. One of the things that helps us to have resilience is when we have a sense of belonging. Another one that helps is exercise. So physical exercise, I know everybody probably gets tired of hearing about exercise, but I cannot talk enough about it because it actually does something in the body that is just remarkable. Now, you've probably heard about things like neurons in your brain. So there's something called neuroplasticity, and that basically is just something that allows your brain to grow new branches, right? But if we're going to rewire the brain, you need to grow new branches. Now, if I told you, hey, I want you to grow this plant, and you have water and soil, and maybe it's struggling to grow, what was something that you might want to add to the plant to make it grow a little better? Fertilizer and sunlight, right? So fertilizer. In your brain, you have something that's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It is like fertilizer for your neurons. And do you know what helps to create more fertilizer for your neurons so your brain can grow new branches? Exercise. Serotonin also does it too. And this is part of the reason why antidepressants oftentimes have serotonin as that main target. But when they've compared SSRIs and antidepressants to exercise, exercise beat it out. They did one of the largest clinical trials that had over 8,000 people in it. And they tracked them for over 6 months, and exercise beat out everything, including therapy. Put me out of the business. Amazing stuff, exercise. That other comment I have here is coming back to ground zero. So the story that I wanted to share with you all just really quick, all these are brief, was a woman who was a martial arts instructor, and she had experienced an assault, and that was part of the reason why she got into martial arts, which incidentally, anything that trains your body to move in a coordinated fashion can really help with trauma. And so she learned how to do martial arts. But then she was out one night, and then she actually had someone, come out there and assault her. And when she was assaulted, it was that learned helplessness thing that came up, and she couldn't move, even though she was like 4th degree black belt, could have just like destroyed this guy and like broke him in pieces, but she couldn't because that dorsal raphe nuclei shut her down, put her into that serotonin, too much serotonin in the dorsal raphe nuclei, put her in that dorsal activation, and she just could not move. So one of the things that that they did, what she did in her training was she took herself back to ground zero. So in the same way, like I said, you can have learned helplessness, you can also learn resiliency. And so what she did is she had, in a safe environment, someone kind of pin her like she was pinned before, but this time she intentionally fought back. And she was very successful at it because she's a very skilled martial artist. And then she talked about how when she was walking one night, she was walking to her car, and I don't know if walking at night is the best idea, but anyway, she was walking to her car, and as she was walking to her car, there were 3 guys that were coming towards her. But this time, she had learned to be resilient. And she saw them coming, and they're like, hey, give me your wallet, and probably some other things they shouldn't be saying. And she's like, all right, let's do this. And they all just like turn the other way because they can tell that she meant business. And she went from learned helplessness to resiliency. But it's because she physically brought herself back to a place where she was in that emergency, but this time she escaped. Now, I want to show you something because the next set here that we're going to be talking about is how the body releases trauma. This was also Charles Hunt. He was somebody who talked about how his faith really helped to get him through his situation. He did a TED Talk, and one of the things he said is after his dad had died in prison, his mom died from a drug overdose, that he was basically almost didn't make it through high school. Now he has a business. He became a multimillionaire for his own business, completely got himself out of poverty. And one of the things that he said, and this was his changing in narrative, he said, the worst of life couldn't take out the best of me. I thought that was beautiful. That is resilience. That is the narrative of resilience. The next one I'm going to share with you all is the somatic experiencing. This is another way that one can begin to cope with trauma. So one of the things it talks about is become comfortable with trembling and shaking. Now, I know that sounds weird, but if you think about what's going on, when I say that somebody's stuck at that level 6, what's happened is the body hasn't finished its activity. Like the person wanted to escape and they couldn't. And then unlike the deer that jumped and bounced and got out of there, they just stayed in that collapsed position. I'm going to show you a video really quick. This is a brief one. I may have to kind of scan along a little bit, but this is a video of a polar bear who actually gets tranquilized. And they wanted to study the polar bear because this is what they do. And they're chasing this polar bear with a helicopter. The helicopter probably to him looks like the largest dragonfly that anyone has ever seen ever, if there's dragonflies in the Arctic. But anyway, this is the polar bear, and I just want you to see what this looks like when somebody kind of allows them to have what's referred to as somatic experiencing. So let me see, I'll cue this up. I'm just going to skip along a little bit just so y'all don't have to, if it'll let me. Let's see. Oops. Okay.
See these, the pads there are sort of like non-skid material, and it's all sort of rough. It's not really smooth. That helps them get better traction on the ice. It's right up. It's almost like sandpaper. And then, of course, big claws for ripping, breaking into seal layers. But he hasn't started to really chip his teeth.
I know, this is such a bad idea, right?
If you watch that animal after he finishes convulsing, you'll see, because he's aware of the fact that we're all around him, and it's a very stressful experience for an animal like a polar bear. After he settles down, and then he'll start doing a couple of deep breaths, and then he'll breathe really nicely.
Listen to these really big breaths.
Look, here he goes. See how he's breathing there now? So even though it looks a little unpleasant, like that, it lets off all that stress, and he then is able to relax and sleep the thing off.
So this is the reason why animals don't get PTSD. There's actually a book, it's written by Robert Sapolsky, and it's called Why Zebras Don't Have Ulcers. And if you really think about this, zebras probably should have ulcers. Their siblings get eaten like every single day. This is awful. I mean, you think we have trauma, man, it's like every day. But yet they don't end up with PTSD. And why is that? It's because after that polar bear experienced the trauma, it's like the polar bear was conscious when it was shaking on the ground like that. It was completely conscious. But what it's doing is it's going back to the spot where the trauma happened, and it's finishing out the action. You can almost see it kind of moving as though it's trying to like fight and struggle. It's like it's playing out in its mind what it meant to do and should have done, and then just breathes really deep and have that, and then like lets all that stuff out and then gets up and it's fine. But we're trained not to do that, right? Because after an accident, we have to be tough. You don't cry, you don't do any of that stuff. And so we don't actually allow our bodies to finish the activity. All right, so this is somatic experiencing. All right, so since you all have this in your notes, I'm gonna move through just a little bit faster because I wanna make sure we leave time for a Q&A. The other piece here is vulnerability. So some of you are familiar with the process that crabs go through. They go through a molting process. If a crab wants to grow, do you know what it needs to do first? It needs to shed the shell. Now the shell is hard and protective, but if it wants to grow, it has to go through this molting process. And this molting process is very detailed. It's actually when they go through this molting process, they shoot little enzymes out, they detach from their shells, and after they break out of that, they become soft and vulnerable to predators. But the crab is teaching us something that we probably all intuitively knew all along, that we don't grow when we're hard. We only grow when we're in a place of vulnerability. This is part of the reason why children are some of the most vulnerable creatures on the planet, is because they're in a constant state of growth. And so one of the things that actually becomes necessary for people to recover from trauma is actually being able to be vulnerable again, which is hard, but necessary. In fact, the word vulnerable comes from the Latin word, which is the exact same word as trauma, because it means wound. But it actually means wound in the sense that somebody is woundable or traumatizable, which is, you can understand why people who've had trauma don't want to go there. But it's exactly where they need to be able to go if they're going to make it and if they're going to change. So not being vulnerable actually prevents the healing process. So vulnerability actually can help initiate that process. All right, so for the rest of these, I'll let you kind of go through them. Some of them are like body boundary things, like being able to tap on the body and remind yourself where your extremities are, because when people dissociate, again, because trauma happens in the body, you have to use the body to bring the person back online. And so people can sometimes do one where they have their right hand under their armpit and the other arm around here, and just by like holding and squeezing and doing that, it actually starts to create a soothing response in the body, because it's like the body doesn't know where it stops and ends. And if you actually do this for your body, things like this can actually help. Okay, last couple ones here. Breath holding can actually be really effective. I do not recommend this one for everyone, and certainly do not recommend it underwater. But when you hold your breath, it actually stimulates your body to go into a hyper state. But when you actually are able to stay calm, even when you're not breathing, this trains your body to relax in the presence of stress. And so actually learning how to hold your breath for longer periods of time is helpful. 6, 7, 8 breathing is a really helpful one. You breathe in for a count of 6, hold for a count of 7, exhale for a count of 8. Another really fast one is when you do a double sigh. You breathe in all the way, and once you get to the top, you do an extra sigh. Immediately when you do this, it actually helps your vagus nerve will help to slow down your heart rate. So these are all rapid ways that you can begin to help the body to relax, because again, trauma starts in the body. All right, for all the things that I could share with you, the last one that I'll probably share with you around this whole polyvagal exercise is humming. So if you all just do another exercise with me, I just want you to go ahead and breathe in through your nose. And when you breathe out, just kind of hum. Okay, now when people hum, whether they're humming songs or anything else, when you hum, what happens is you actually increase the amount of nitric oxide in your nostrils. When you do that, it actually helps to stimulate your immune system. It helps to stimulate your vagus nerve. It helps to actually calm your body down. So when they found that when people were humming through their nose on their out breaths, it actually began to help to calm their nervous system and increase their immunity. Free, like it was free, like, no meds needed, right? This is incredible stuff. Snoring, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I can't say that one does it, but laughing does. So thank you. Like you just got us down to our other one there. So laughing actually does help to stimulate the vagus nerve, and along with several other things. So if you all would like to have more of these, some other interesting one is that probiotics help. When they did experiments with mice where they did not have enough gut bacteria, they found that when they added probiotics, it actually decreased their anxiety levels. The whole body is interconnected. All right. EMDR, I can talk more about that maybe at another time, but EMDR uses bilateral stimulation, the rapid movements of the eyes back and forth, similar to what happens when you're in REM sleep. When you are in REM sleep, your body, your brain is processing memories and emotions, and so the movement of bilateral stimulation actually helps to calm the nervous system. It's a treatment approach that I've used to help people with trauma, and it's had rapid effects on people being able to recover. So this is my last slide here. How many people are familiar with kintsugi? Anybody have heard of this before? And I really love this. Kintsugi is a Japanese form of art where when pottery is broken and it's fragmented and all the pieces are all over the place and it looks like it's been destroyed, what they do is they put it back together again, but they seal the cracks with the most precious materials affordable. They usually do it with gold and precious metals so that the places where the person or the pottery has been broken, instead of becoming the source of ugliness and decay, become the sources of beauty and value. And if there's anything that I have seen, it's that when people recover, they don't come out like they were before, they come out better, because better is the only option. And only the most precious materials can be used to heal the fragmented or broken heart. And so with that, I want to leave you all here with this. And so hopefully this presentation has been helpful to you all, and I appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you, David. Hopefully you benefited from that. I did. I'm thankful for the simple and practical ways to begin healing. How many of you are blessed in hearing some of those? Yeah, all right. And just a few things. As we're gathering up the cards, by the way, if you had questions, go ahead and turn those in. We're going to have people come down the aisles, I think. Raise your hand if you have a card or a question. One here. All right. And while they're picking those up, I'll just share a few things with you. Number one, I'm thankful that healing is attainable. How about you? I think David made that very clear tonight. And that's hope for a lot of people who may be struggling this evening. And number two, I think that next time we see each other around 3 o'clock tomorrow, I should hear you singing. And humming, and even trembling and shaking and deep sighing, like the polar bear. I really appreciated the polar bear. I felt the polar bear tonight. How about you? And finally, I was thankful also that these things are right around the corner, and even exercise is something that's very attainable to us. So, David, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing some of those attainable ways of healing our trauma.
Okay.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Right.
Questions tonight, David? Are you ready?
Yes, I am.
All right. Should a non-traumatized or a non-hurt or a non-harm meant person force with love, insist, or trick a non-compliant but traumatized person to seek therapy for their honest good and that of others around them?
Okay, so the short answer is no, and the reason is just because the key word there is force. So the question was, should you force somebody to engage in therapy when you know that they have trauma? And the reason why I would not force them is because part of what usually causes trauma is not having a choice. And so part of what happens even when somebody comes in for therapy is I never push them faster than they're ready to go. I've actually sat and talked with people for almost a year before they even acknowledge that something happened. And so sometimes it takes time, but you have to be patient with that process. But encourage them 100%. Love on them and show them that there's a better way and give them hope 100%, but never push somebody to go for it.
Thank you, David. Next question is autism a form of PTSD?
That's a really good question. So no, autism is a different diagnosis, but what is interesting though is when somebody has PTSD, they can show symptoms that look autistic. And part of the reason for that is when somebody has PTSD, it shuts down a lot of the social parts of the brain, and they have great difficulty reading social cues. So will there be overlap in symptoms? You bet. But are they the same thing, or does one cause the other? Not necessarily, no.
Next question is, can death of a family member cause trauma?
Yes. Yeah, short answer on that one is yes. Death of a family member can cause trauma. So even though the DSM, which is a diagnostic statistical manual for mental health disorders, doesn't have grief as a source of trauma, if somebody witnesses the death or becomes aware of it and it was something that was brutal or gruesome, then the DSM qualifies it that way. The problem though is that if trauma is what happens in the body and not what happens to you, then it really doesn't make sense to say unless it happened this way, it's not trauma. You can be traumatized by a lot of things that are not covered by the DSM. If it happens in you, then it's real. So it's just like asking, well, can you have a scar if you weren't cut by a sword? It's like, well, yes, of course you can. So
The next question is about resources. Is there one book that will repeat or expound on what you shared this evening? Please do tell.
okay. All right. So The Body Keeps the Score is a very popular book, but not for the faint of heart. There's, excessive use of language if anybody cares about that. But that was one book that recommends a lot of treatment protocols. So Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk is one. Another one that talks about this similar topic is PTSD treatment protocols. But there's just so many books out there for trauma. You really want to find out what kind of approach you want. There are ones that are faith-based that if that's the kind of approach you're looking for, then you'd want to find those titles. But there are lots of them out there. But that's one that generally has been pretty understandable.
Also, if there's someone who's interested in starting therapy, is there contact information that we can share with them, some way to reach out to you?
Yes. So in the back, when you walk out, I do have some of my business cards back there if somebody wants to reach out to me personally. The place I recommend checking out, though, is on Psychology Today. If you go to psychologytoday.com, you can actually narrow down therapists based on location, insurance, and treatment approach. Then again, that includes if somebody wants religious counseling or any of those things, you can specify that and narrow down exactly what kind of counselor you're looking for.
Fantastic. And the last question is, are these recorded? Can we watch them later?
Yes. Yes, that's a really easy one. So yes, absolutely. So we can find them on two different places. One of them is on our YouTube page, and the other one is on our Facebook page. Do you remember the URL? Okay, so Centralia SDA. Yeah. So if you type that in, you should be able to find this lecture. It's been recorded, and so hopefully you should be able to find it there.
Thank you, David. Well, we want to thank you for being out this evening. Just a reminder, tomorrow, again at 2 p.m. to 3 p.m., we'll be meeting with Dr. Jennifer Schwartzer, and she'll be talking about abuse in the church. And then from 3:30 to 4:30, Shannon Vega will be sharing with us again about child-teen development and mental health warning signs. That's 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock for both of those sessions. We would love to see all of you back out again. Hopefully you enjoyed yourself and you gained some understanding of how healing for the brain can take place. We welcome you all out again tomorrow. Have a blessed evening, and we'll see you all then.